This chapter will examine international commodity trade and focuses on international monetary and macro issues. The balance of payments, also known as balance of international payments, encompasses all transactions between a country's residents and its non-residents involving goods, services, and income, financial claims and liabilities to the rest of the world, and transfers such as gifts. The BOP is divided into three main categories: the current account, the capital account, and the financial account. Within these three categories are subdivisions, each of these account for a different type of international monetary transactions. The current account is used to mark the inflow and outflow of goods and services into a country. Earnings on investment, both public and private, are also put into the current account. Within the current account are credits and debits on the trade of merchandise, which includes the goods such as raw materials and manufactured goods that are bought, sold, or given away, or possibly in the form of aid. Services refers to receipts from tourism, transportation, engineering, business service fees, and royalties from patents and copyrights. When combined, goods and services together make up a country's balance of trade. The balance of trade is typically the biggest bulk of a country's balance of payments, as it makes up all total imports and exports. If a country has a balance of trade deficit, it imports more than it exports, and if it has a balance of trade surplus, it exports more than it imports. Capital flight in economics occurs when assets or money rapidly flow out of a country due to an event of economic consequences. Such events could be an increase in taxes on capital or capital holders, or the government of the country defaulting on its debt that disturbs investors and causes them to lower their valuation of the assets in the country, or otherwise to lose confidence in its economic strength. This leads to the disappearance of wealth and is usually accompanied by a sharp drop in the exchange rate of the affected country, depreciation in a variable exchange rate regime, or forced devaluation in a fixed exchange rate regime. This fall is particularly damaging when the capital belongs to the people of the affected country, because not only are the citizens now burdened by the loss in the economy and the valuation of their currency, but probably also their assets have lost much of their nominal value. This leads to dramatic decreases in the purchasing power of the country's assets and makes it increasingly expensive to import goods and acquire any form of foreign facilities. Example, medical facilities. Capital flight may be legal or illegal under domestic law. Legal capital flight is recorded on the book of entity or individual making the transfer, and earnings from the interest, dividends, and realized capital gains normally return to the country of origin. Illegal capital flight, also known as illicit financial flows, is intended to disappear from any record in the country of origin, and earnings on the stock of illegal capital flight outside of a country generally do not return to the country of origin. It is indicated as missing money from a nation's balance of payment.
When a country is facing existing or projected balance of payments deficits on combined current and capital accounts, this developing nation have a variety of policy options. First, they can seek to improve the balance on current account by promoting export expansion, limiting imports, or both. In the former case, there is the further choice of concentrating on primary or secondary product export expansion. In the latter case, policies of import substitutions or selective tariffs and physical quotas or bans on the importation of specific consumer goods may be tried. Or countries can seek to achieve both objectives simultaneously by altering their official foreign exchange rates through a currency devaluations that lowers export prices and increasing import prices. Developing countries can also try to improve the balance on their capital account by encouraging more private, foreign direct or portfolio investment, borrowing from international commercial banks, or seeking more public foreign assistance or aid. But neither private foreign investment nor a majority of foreign aid comes in the form of gifts. The receipt of loan assistance implies the necessity of future repayments of principal and interest. Developing nations can seek to modify the detrimental impact of chronic balance of payments deficits by expanding their stocks of official monetary reserves. One way of doing this is through the acquisition of a greater share of international paper gold, known as the Special Drawing Rights or SDRs. Traditionally, under the workings of the international monetary system, countries with deficits in their balance of payments were required to pay for these deficits by drawing down on their official reserves of the two principal international monetary assets, which is gold and the US dollars. But with the growth in the volume and value of world trade, a new kind of international asset was needed to supplement the limited stock of gold and dollars. Consequently, in 1970, the IMF was given the authority to create special drawing rights. These international assets perform many functions of gold and dollars in settling balance of payments. They are valued on the basis of a basket of currencies, the US dollar, the euro, the pound sterling, and the Japanese yen. And, of course, constitute claims on the IMF. They may be exchanged for convertible currencies to settle international official transactions. And last, they can seek loans and assistance from the World Bank or the IMF. Traditionally, this has required that the countries follow the very restrictive fiscal and monetary policies. Stabilization policies and structural adjustment, both packages of preconditions for receiving loans, are popularly referred to as conditionality. These policies are designed to reduce domestic demand so as to lower imports and reduce the inflationary pressures that may have contributed to the overvalued exchange rate that slowed exports and promoted imports. In recent years, these institutions have shown somewhat less policy inflexibility, but it is not yet clear whether this trend will continue. Since I have mentioned about the World Bank, I will now discuss some information about it. The World Bank was created in 1944 as one of the Bretton Woods institutions, consists of 5 separate organizations: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Development Association, the International Finance Corporation, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and the International Center for Settlement Investment Disputes. World Bank has 189 member countries. In 2012, Dr. Jim Yong Kim, as a U.S. citizen and born in South Korea, became the 12th president of the World Bank. Kim set about extensive reform measures and in October 2013 committed the bank to prioritizing twin goals: ending extreme poverty by 2030 and boosting shared prosperity for the bottom 40% of the population in all developing countries. Throughout the year, however, powers are delegated to a board of 24 executive directors or EDs. The 5 largest shareholders, the US, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Japan, have an individual ED, and the 19 additional EDs represent the rest of the member states as groups of constituencies. Of these 19, however, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia have opted to be single-country constituencies, which means that they have each one representative within the 19 EDs. This decision is based on the fact that these countries have large, influential economies, requiring that their interests be voiced individually rather than diluted within a group. At the time, its principal concern was rebuilding economies shattered during World War II. Loans are offered on commercial terms to borrowing governments or to private enterprises that have obtained government guarantees, but rates are modest due to the bank's high credit rating for its own borrowing. The bank group works with country governments, the private sector, civil society organizations, regional development banks, think tanks, and other international institutions on issues ranging from climate change, conflict, and food security to education, agriculture, finance, and trade. In the 1950s, the focus was on physical capital. The bank began similar lending in a growing number of developing countries for infrastructure, such as roads, electrical grids, and dams, and later increasingly for agricultural investments to assist export expansion. By the late 1960s, for the first time, the bank began to direct its attention to poverty reduction and so to put a priority on rural development. One focus was on improved access to development resources for small farmers who had been bypassed by previous development projects. Success was mixed at best, however, and agriculture lending fell drastically in subsequent years. In the 1970s and early 1980s, developing countries took on a lot of debt. The bank started concentrating on structural adjustment loans, large loans that came with certain conditions on what the country could do with the money and what kinds of policies they needed to implement. Primarily focused on liberalization, marketization, and privatization. The activities of the bank to a large extent merged with the fund in this period and were heavily criticized by many economic development specialists and by developing countries. For example, the poor were harmed by the emphasis on policies such as cost recovery for services that in many cases in Africa and elsewhere were expected to extend to school and health care fees. The goal of debt reduction was often explicit. Primary beneficiaries would include foreign banks. Structural adjustment loans were designed to promote a fundamental restructuring of the economy's countries plagued with chronic trade and budget deficits by improving the macroeconomic policy environment with an emphasis on 1. Mobilizing domestic savings through fiscal and financial policies. 2. Improving public sector efficiency by stressing predetermined allocation of public investments and improving the efficiency of public interests. 3. Improving the productivity of public sector investments by liberalizing trade and domestic economic policies. And 4. Reforming institutional arrangements to support the adjustment process. By the mid-1990s, the bank resumed the greater focus on poverty. President James Wolfenson, in what bank called its social capital decade, led a broadening of its focus on social protection, and after years in which many heavily indebted poor countries saw a little development, a little progress repaying loans, the Poverty Reduction Strategy Paper, or PRSP, approach was introduced jointly with the IMF. Although intended to improve on this experience, it remained very uneven, most obviously because of its weak connection to actual budgets. However, debt burdens did begin to decrease in Africa during the 2000s through various initiatives. The bank was sometimes criticized in this period for placing too little emphasis on government institutions for fostering development, such as coordination and industrial policy. The early 2000s also saw a focus on anti-corruption and improvement on governance in general and off-program management in particular. At the same time, the bank has been positioning itself in the field of global public goods, focusing on the resolution of global aspects of the financial crisis, public health, vaccines, disease, and climate change brought about by global warming, where officials at the bank see opportunities for expansion of its mandate.
If you're confused by the difference between the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, well, you're not the only one. Famed economist John Maynard Keynes, who was a founding father of both institutions, said that he was confused just by their names. The IMF and the World Bank are closely linked. So close that their headquarters are across the street from each other here in Washington. So what's the difference between them? It all started at this hotel in New Hampshire in July 1944, where 44 countries gathered for the Bretton Woods Conference. The goal of the conference was to agree on a new framework for the international monetary system, which is the rules and institutions that keep the global economy running smoothly. After World War II, most people agreed that the old system had failed. It had seen the Great Depression, unfair trade policies, and unstable currencies. After 3 weeks of heated negotiations at Bretton Woods, especially between Keynes, who was representing the United Kingdom, and Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury representative, a deal was reached. The agreement created the IMF and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, soon to be known as the World Bank. Each institution was given a distinct role. The IMF's job was to oversee a system of fixed exchange rates, which tied the value of a country's currency to the US dollar, which was pegged to gold. The main purpose of this was to make sure exchange rates stayed stable to encourage global trade. The IMF was also tasked with providing short-term loans to countries struggling to pay their debts. Meanwhile, the main goal of the World Bank was to give financial assistance to countries, mainly in Europe, that needed to rebuild after the war. The roles of both the IMF and the World Bank have changed a lot since the days of Bretton Woods. President Nixon unpegged the US dollar from gold in 1971, essentially dissolving the fixed exchange rate system that the IMF oversaw. Since then, the IMF has taken on a bigger role fighting financial crises around the world. It keeps tabs on the global economy and puts economic policies in place in member countries. The World Bank focuses its efforts on development and reducing poverty. It provides funding and resources in projects in some of the poorest countries in the world. Both institutions include 189 member countries, but the IMF has around 2,700 employees, compared to the World Bank staff of 10,000. The IMF is funded mainly by quotas, basically subscription fees from member countries. It receives around $675 billion in quotas, with the US, Japan, China, and Germany contributing the most. The World Bank is financed mostly by issuing bonds to global investors. The group's lending commitments reached nearly $59 billion in fiscal year 2017. The IMF has committed $160 billion under its current lending arrangements. Today, the IMF's biggest borrowers include Greece, Ukraine, Portugal, and Pakistan. The places where the World Bank is running the most projects are in Africa and East Asia. One thing the IMF and the World Bank have in common is that they both have some opponents. Critics point to the conditions attached to their loans, saying they don't always address the specific economic issues within a country. The IMF has come under fire for continuing to bail out Greece, even as the country has failed to clean up its finances. Human rights groups have criticized the World Bank for ignoring the environmental and social impacts of some of its projects in countries like Ethiopia or Myanmar. But the IMF and the World Bank say they promote global economic stability. They make countries less vulnerable to crises, promote higher living standards, and provide vital help to countries that need it.
External debt is the total private and public foreign debt owed by a country. The accumulation of this is a common phenomenon on developing countries at the stage of economic development where the supply of domestic savings is low, current account payments deficits are high, and imports of capital are needed to augment domestic resources. Actually, foreign borrowing can be highly beneficial, providing the resources necessary to promote economic growth and development, but when it's poorly managed, it can be very costly. However, when the composition of imports change or interest rates rise significantly, causing a ballooning of debt service payments, or export earnings diminish, debt servicing difficulty are likely to arise. First, it is necessary to understand a fundamental concept known as the basic transfer. It is defined as the net foreign exchange inflow or outflow related to its international borrowing. It measures the difference between the net capital inflow and the interest payments on the existing accumulated debt. So basically, basic transfer equation will be BT is equals to small t times capital D minus small r times capital D, or quantity small d minus small r times capital D, where small d times t is a net capital inflow and small r times t is the total annual interest payments. A serious problem can arise, however, when the accumulated debt becomes very large so that its rate of increase naturally begins to decline as amortization rises relative to rates of new gross inflows. Second, when the sources of foreign capital switched from long-term on fixed concessional terms to short terms, variable rate private bank loans at market rates that causes the rate of interest to rise. Third, when the country begins to experience severe balance of payments problems as commodity prices plummet and the terms of trade rapidly deteriorate. Fourth, when a global recession or some other external shock such as a jump in oil prices, a steep rise in U.S. interest rates on which variable rate private loans are based, or a sudden change in the value of the dollar in which most debts are denominated takes place. Fifth, when a loss in confidence in the ability of a developing country to repay, resulting from points 2, 3, and 4, causing private international banks to cut off their flow of new lending. Sixth, when a substantial flight of capital is precipitated by local residents who, for political or economic reasons, send great sums of money out of the country to be invested in developed country financial securities, real estates, and bank accounts. The mechanics of petrodollar recycling. OPEC countries exports oil. Then Europe, Japan, and the United States send dollars to OPEC countries to pay for the imported oil. And these dollars will be deposited by OPEC countries to US and European banks. Then these banks will lend the OPEC's petrodollars to developing country borrowers, leading to debt expansion. Then these developing country debtors pay the debt service interest plus the principal back to the US and European banks. Macroeconomic instability is a situation in which a country has high inflation accompanied by rising budget and trade deficits by a rapidly expanding money supply. While stabilization policies is a coordinated set of mostly restrictive fiscal and monetary policies aimed at reducing inflation, cutting budget deficits, and improving the balances of payments. Here are the four basic components to the typical IMF stabilization program. First, abolition or liberalization of foreign exchange and import controls. Second, devaluation of the official exchange rate. Third, a stringent domestic anti-inflation program consisting of A. Control of bank credit to raise interest rates and reserve requirements. B. Control of the government deficit through curbs or spending, including in the areas of social services for the poor and staple food subsidies, along with increase in taxes and in public enterprise prices. C. Control of wage increases, in particular abolishing wage indexing. And D. Dismantling of various forms of price controls and promoting freer markets. The IMF became newly engaged in funding and stabilization packages in the wake of the global financial crisis, especially in various hard-hit Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union states in 2008 to 2010, to receive their loans and, more important, to negotiate additional credits from private banks. All these nations were required to adopt some or all of the enumerated stabilization policies. Although such policies may be successful in reducing inflation and improving the balance of payment situation for many developing countries, they can be politically very unpopular because they strike the heart of development efforts by disproportionately hurting the lower and middle income groups. Alternatively, they have often been viewed by leaders in developing nations as representing a double standard, harsh adjustment policies for developing country debtors and no adjustment of the huge budget or trade deficits for the world's greatest debtor, the United States. And because IMF policies are being imposed by an international agency that is perceived by those of the dependent school to be merely an arm of the rich industrialized nation. Stabilization policies are often viewed by these schools as measures designed primarily to maintain the poverty and dependence of developing countries while preserving the global market structure for the international banks and private investors from the industrialized nations. While for those less radical observers, they view the IMF as neither pro-development nor anti-development but simply as an institution trying to carry out its original mandate to hold the global capitalist market together through the pursuit of orthodox short-term international financial policies. Fears were voiced that if a group of debtor nations were jointly to repudiate or refuse to accept their debts by forming a debtors cartel, which means a group of developing country debtors who join together to bargain as a group with creditors, the economies of Western nations might be seriously affected. Numerous proposals for relieving or restructuring the debt burdens of highly indebted nations have been proposed, with several implemented, at least in part. Restructuring means altering the terms and conditions of debt repayment, usually by lowering interest rates or extending the repayment period. For commercial banks, the 1989 Brady Plan linked partial debt forgiveness for selected borrowers to IMF or World Bank financial support, guaranteeing the payment of the remaining loans as well as the commitments by the indebted developing countries to adopt stringent IMF-type adjustment programs, promote free markets, welcome foreign investors, and repatriate overseas capital. In addition, there has been much discussion of debt for equity swaps, meaning a mechanism used by indebted developing countries to reduce the real value of external debt by exchanging equity in domestic companies or fixed interest obligations of the government for private foreign debt at large discount. These corporations then trade a debtor's IOU for a local state-owned asset such as a steel mill or a telephone company. Commercial banks are now more willing to engage in such transactions because new interpretation and regulation for US banks permit them to take a loss on a loan swap while not reducing the book value of other loans to that country. An appealing but much less significant swap arrangement is the debt for nature swap, or the exchange of foreign debt held by an organization for a larger quantity of domestic debt that is used to finance and preservation of a natural resources or environment in the debtor country. It intended to win commitments by a developing country's government or environmental preservation of such assets as the rainforest in Ecuador or a national park in Costa Rica. Most debt for nature swaps are carved out by non-governmental organizations.
I will tackle about the global financial crisis and the developing countries. The financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, or also known as the global financial crisis and the 2008 financial crisis, was a severe worldwide economic crisis considered by many economists to have been the most serious financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s, to which it is often compared to. The period of general economic decline, or also called as a Great Recession, was observed in the market. The International Monetary Fund has concluded that it has the most severe economic and financial meltdown since the Great Depression, and it is often regarded as the second worst downturn of all time. The Great Recession stemmed from the collapse of the United States real estate market in relation to the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 and the subprime mortgage crisis. The Great Recession resulted in a scarcity of valuable assets in the market economy and the collapse of the financial sector or banks in the world economy. Some banks were bailed out by the government of the US. But what are the causes of the crisis? The first cause is the financial deregulation. Financial deregulation is the process of removing government rules controlling the way that banks and other financial organizations operate. Other developed countries, including several in Europe such as Spain, had parallel financial stability problems that were exposed by the crisis. The result was a fragile financial system with high leverage and complex and incompletely understood financial securities. The second major factor in the crisis was the chronic international trade imbalances between East Asia, notably China, and the developed countries, particularly the United States, with concomitant capital flows into the United States. A trade deficit is an economic measure of international trade in which a country's imports exceed exports. A trade deficit represents an outflow of domestic currency to foreign markets. It is also referred to as a negative balance of trade. Trade deficit equals total value of imports minus total value of exports. A trade deficit typically occurs when a country fails to produce enough goods for its residents. However, in some cases, a deficit can signal that a country's consumers are wealthy enough to purchase more goods than their country produces. These trade imbalances help keep capital cheap and fuel the housing bubbles in the United States and some European countries. Most international financial crises since World War II were viewed as originating in the developing world. From the Latin American debt crisis of 1982 to the Mexican tequila crisis of 1994 to the East Asian contagion of 1998 and the Argentine default in 2001. Problems were perceived as caused by developing economies, weak financial markets and institutions, and unstable political economy. With each crisis, the affected countries were pressured to open and liberalize their economies. In 2010, President Obama announced an objective of doubling U.S. exports in 5 years. China rejected pressure from the United States and other countries to stop resisting market forces for its exchange rate to rise, though eventually appreciation did take place. The second part of my report would be about the economic impact on developing countries. We now review 9 areas of impacts. The first one is the economic growth. In 2007 and the first half of 2008, developing countries were affected less than developed countries. But in the second half of 2008, the impact was quite severe in most developing regions, continuing through 2009. As the 2009 World Investment Report put it, developing countries weathered the global financial crisis better than developed countries as their financial systems were less closely interlinked with the hard-hit banking systems of the United States and Europe. The IMF says that the world economy has entered yet another transition. Advanced economies are gradually strengthening. At the same time, growth in emerging markets economies has slowed. This confluence is leading to tensions, with emerging markets economies facing the dual challenges of slowing growth and tighter global financial conditions. IMF economic counselor Olivier Blanchard also wrote that unusually favorable world conditions, including high commodity prices and rapid financial market development, increased potential growth in emerging market or developing economies during the 2000s, and in a number of them, there was a cyclical component on top. As commodity prices stabilize and financial conditions tighten, potential growth is lower, leading in some cases to a sharp cyclical adjustment. The second one is the exports. Exports fell drastically in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. World trade volumes fell 14.4% in 2009, the largest drop in decades, but then rebounded strongly before returning to modest growth from 2011. The IMF examined one of the central questions of the crisis for economic development. Do financial crises have lasting effects on trade? Well, the research examined the evidence since 1970 and found that imports remained depressed even in the medium term after banking crisis, while exports from the crisis countries were relatively unaffected. Countries with banking crises that also had higher current account deficits generally experienced larger declines in imports. These findings supported concern that opportunities for developing countries to expand exports to the United States and to the significant number of European countries that experience banking crises will be more limited for several years. Yet, another factor underscoring the renewed priority placed on trade among developing nations. The third cause is the foreign investment inflows. A United Nations Conference on Trade and Development study concluded that global crises curtailed the funding available for FDI. They noted that FDI inflows to developing and transition economies declined by 27% to $548 billion in 2009. Following 6 years of uninterrupted growth, while their FDI contracted, this grouping appeared more resilient to the crisis than developed countries. Their share in global FDI inflows kept rising. For the first time ever, developing and transition economies are now absorbing half of global FDI inflows. Following almost a decade of uninterrupted growth, FDI falls to Africa fell to $59 billion, a 19% decline compared to 2008, mainly due to contraction in global demand and falling commodity prices. Next is developing country stock market. Prices subsequently resumed their rise and markets deepened in the few rapidly growing economies, notably China and India. The fifth one is aid. Major donors' aid to developing countries fell by nearly 3% in 2011, breaking a long trend of annual increases. Aid is only a fraction of total flows to low-income countries, but these hard economic times also mean lower investment and lower exports. Next is the distribution of influence among developing countries. During the Cold War, countries were asked to take sides, aligning themselves with the United States or other countries, or the Soviet Union or China. These conflicts spilled to the non-aligned movement, which included countries with clear alliances. Seventh is the worker remittances. Remittances to developing countries from migrant workers had reached a record of $336 billion in 2008, though less than 10% of this went to the low-income countries. Next is poverty. In developing countries, the crisis affected earnings more than employment. In the aftermath of the crisis, lower growth reduced the rate of poverty. Reduction in most developing countries, and in many countries, the number of people living in poverty increased. In the 2010 Millennium Development Goals Report, drawing on newly updated estimates from the World Bank, estimated that an additional 50 million people were living in extreme poverty in 2009. And the last one is health and education. Deaths that would not have been taken place had subprime crisis, which began in the United States, not spread to African countries. They find that the bulk of additional children who will die is likely to be found among poorer households, in rural areas, and those in lower education levels, and in concentrated among girls. Impacts generally differ across countries. The third part of my report is about differing impacts and continuing challenges across developing regions. The first country is Asia. During the period from September 2008 to March 2009, there was a dramatic slowdown and, in some cases, major reversal of the high export growth and GDP growth that the East Asian region, including China, had come to take for granted. The subsequent rebound was strong but uneven. China weathered the initial crisis well, partly due to its own massive stimulus package of almost $600 billion, a much higher share of GDP than the corresponding US package of about $800 billion. Infrastructure and other investment levels have also been at historically unprecedented levels, with nearly half of output represented in investment in official statistics, but a significant fraction of it apparently yielding low returns. China's economic policymakers appear focused on decreasing reliance on basic exports that rely on processing of imports for modest value added before re-export. Moreover, China's growth has been decelerating from unsustainable levels that have continued longer than previously expected, partly as a result of the boost from the post-crisis stimulus package and subsequent lending policies. China also found its way under considerable pressure to allow its currency to increase in value in the aftermath of the crisis. In fall 2010, the finance minister of Brazil announced the world had moved into an international currency war. Brazil then doubled the tax on foreign purchases of bonds to keep its currency, the real, from appreciating via capital inflows and other countries. The response from China's Premier Wen Jiabao was to note the thin profits margins of export companies, and he said that with revaluation, many of our exporting companies would have to close down, and migrant workers would have to return to their villages. The five high-income economies in the region, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan and Hong Kong, and South Korea, remain dependent on exports for growth by global standards, and all experience substantial declines in exports. Recovery in middle and low-income countries, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Thailand, was also strong. Three of these five countries reported negative growth after the crisis, but no greater decline than 2.7% demand from China helped raise exports from East and Southeast Asia overall. Initially, the Indian economy weathered the financial crisis relatively well. During the crisis, the central government fiscal deficit rose to nearly 7% of GDP. GDP growth in India fell from its torrid pace of nearly 10% in 2007 to less than 4% in 2008, reflecting the impact of the crisis. It then recovered dramatically to almost 8.5 in 2009 and to nearly 10.5 in 2010, the first time growth ever topped 10% in India. Low levels of trade coupled with relatively high commodity prices for its exports in some ways helped insulate sub-Saharan Africa from the brunt of the crisis. Recovery has been very sluggish in much of the MENA region, as growth has continued to be slow in the 2010 to 2013 period in several important countries. In 2013, in Egypt, the economic turmoil also created economic and political uncertainty and led to a further drop in investment and tourism. The economic breakdown in Syria has struck the brutality of its civil war. Even in countries that have not experienced turmoil, some spillovers, including investor perceptions, have led to falls in economic activity. Despite concerns that the crisis would quickly lead to a repeat of past crises in the region, many countries weathered the initial shocks very well. Mexico suffered an economic contraction of about 6.5% in 2009. Argentina was hit hard by the crisis, rebounded very strongly in 2010 and 2011, but then
slipped back into slow GDP growth, less than 2% in 2012. Brazil at first weathered the crisis well, with 6% growth in 2007 and 5% growth in 2008, in no small part due to the boost the economy exports, particularly to China, now its largest trading partner. Opportunities as well as dangers. Throughout the developing world, the unfolding crisis and its aftershocks were viewed with fear. What would happen to markets for their vital exports? But there is no doubt that many policymakers in China and in other fast-growing developing nations quickly came also to view the crisis as a great opportunity and a critical turning point. The emergence of China as a possible regional engine of growth could allow less dependence on exports to Western markets. Although several countries in the region were also alarmed about China's intentions, and several African nations have become enthusiastic about the emergence of China as a commodities investors as a counterweight to long powerful Western companies. But hopes have been dimmed in many parts of the developing world for open and stable access of developed country markets. Since the 2008 crisis, politicians have considered it inexpedient to be viewed as extending concessions on trade. The crisis also revealed to developed countries that despite the assurances of WTO rules, the United States, the European Union, and other advanced regions could effectively get away with reverting to protectionism, at least in the short run, when they found to be politically expedient.